It is the most powerful weapon ever invented. It holds the world economy hostage, starts and ends wars, and determines the fate of nations. Yet, you can hold it in your hand. It's a simple piece of paper, printed with green ink. An invention so successful, so deeply embedded in our lives, we never even see the system it controls. It is an invisible empire, an empire built not on land, but on a promise made 50 years ago in the middle of the desert. And that promise is about to be broken. For half a century, the world has run on a single fuel, the US dollar. Every barrel of oil, every shipment of grain, every transaction of significance was priced and paid for in American currency. This system, known as the petrodollar, became the foundation of American global power. It allowed one nation to consume more than it produced, to spend more than it earned, and to police the world. But what happens when that system begins to die? What happens when the world decides it no longer wants to play by America's rules? This is not a story about economics. It's a story about power. It's about the slow, silent death of an empire and the chaotic birth of a new one. To understand where we are going, we have to understand how we got here. The year is 1944. The world is in ruins. From the ashes of World War II, the leaders of the Allied nations gathered at a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. They had a monumental task: to build a new global financial system, one that would prevent the kind of economic chaos that led to the war. The solution they devised was simple and elegant. The US dollar would be the world's reserve currency, and the dollar, in turn, would be backed by gold at a fixed rate of $35 an ounce. Any country holding dollars could, in theory, show up to the US Treasury and exchange them for physical gold. This was the bedrock of global stability. A dollar was as good as gold. For nearly 3 decades, the Bretton Woods system worked. It fueled the post-war reconstruction of Europe and Japan and ushered in an era of unprecedented prosperity. But America had a problem. It had made too many promises. The cost of the Vietnam War was spiraling out of control. President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs expanded the social safety net at home. To pay for it all, America was doing what any government with a printing press is tempted to do. It was printing money. Far more money than it had gold in its vaults to back up. Other countries, especially France, grew suspicious. They began to see the United States was writing checks it couldn't cash. They started calling America's bluff, sending warships to New York Harbor to exchange their dollars for gold, draining the US reserves at an alarming rate. The system was buckling. By 1971, President Richard Nixon was trapped. If he did nothing, the country would run out of gold, triggering a catastrophic collapse of the dollar. So on a Sunday night in August, he went on television and delivered a speech that changed the world forever. He announced the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold. He called it closing the gold window. The world called it the Nixon Shock. In an instant, the global financial system was untethered. The dollar, and every other currency, was now backed by nothing but faith in the government that issued it. It was a moment of profound crisis. The dollar's value plunged, inflation soared, and for the United States, its position as the world's banker was in mortal danger. A new anchor was needed, something the entire world had to have. Something as valuable, as essential, as gold. The answer was oil. The black gold that powered the industrial world. In 1973, the world was hit by a crippling oil crisis. Angered by American support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War, the Arab members of OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, declared an embargo. They cut production and stopped shipments to the United States and its allies. Gas prices quadrupled overnight. Lines stretched for miles at gas stations. The global economy ground to a halt. It was a demonstration of terrifying power. A few desert kingdoms could bring the mighty West to its knees. But within this crisis, American strategists saw an opportunity. A brilliant, audacious plan was hatched in secrecy. In 1974, U.S. Treasury Secretary William Simon and his deputy, Henry Kissinger, embarked on a secret mission to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. The deal they offered the Saudi royal family was groundbreaking. The United States would provide the kingdom with advanced military hardware, training, and a security guarantee, protecting their oil fields from any and all threats. In return, Saudi Arabia had to do two things. First, they had to agree to price and sell all of their oil, every single barrel, exclusively in US dollars. Second, they had to take the billions of excess dollars they earned and invest them back into US government debt. This recycled the dollars, funding America's own deficits. It was a masterstroke. Soon, the other OPEC nations followed Saudi Arabia's lead. The petrodollar system was born. From that moment on, any country that wanted to buy oil on the global market first had to acquire US dollars. This created a massive, permanent, artificial demand for American currency. The dollar was no longer backed by gold. It was backed by oil, and the oil was backed by the unmatched power of the US military. This arrangement granted America what one French finance minister called an exorbitant privilege. It could print pieces of paper, and the rest of the world would trade real goods and services for them. America could run huge trade deficits, buying cars from Japan, electronics from Taiwan, and clothes from China, and pay for it all with its own currency. The petrodollar system became the invisible engine of the American century, funding its global ambitions and cementing its status as the world's sole superpower. For decades, the system operated like a perfectly tuned machine. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, American dominance was absolute. It was the unipolar moment. The dollar was king, and there were no challengers. The system gave the United States more than just economic benefits. It gave it a powerful weapon. Because global trade was denominated in dollars, most international transactions had to pass through the U.S. banking system. This gave Washington unprecedented oversight and the ability to punish its enemies. The tool was sanctions. By cutting a country off from the dollar-based financial system, the U.S. could cripple its economy without firing a single shot. Iran, North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, all felt the immense power of financial warfare. The message was clear: defy Washington, and you will be locked out of the global economy. But this power, used too often, began to breed resentment. Nations around the world started to feel like vassals in an American empire, their economic sovereignty held at the mercy of decisions made in Washington. And then, small cracks began to appear in the imperial facade. In the year 2000, Iraqi President Saddam Hussein, himself under crippling sanctions, announced that Iraq would no longer accept dollars for its oil. He insisted on being paid in euros. A few years later, Libya's leader, Muammar Gaddafi, began drawing up plans for a new, gold-backed, Pan-African currency, the Dinar, to compete with the dollar and the euro. Both leaders, who directly challenged the dollar's supremacy in the energy trade, soon found their regimes overthrown by US-led military interventions. The script will not draw a direct causal link, but the correlation was not lost on the rest of the world. Challenging the petrodollar was dangerous. It was the system's third rail, but a new challenger was emerging, one too big to be intimidated, too powerful to be overthrown: China. Through the 1990s and 2000s, China's economy grew at a breathtaking pace. It became the workshop of the world, its factories churning out goods for a global market. This rapid industrialization required a colossal amount of energy. By 2017, China had surpassed the United States as the world's largest importer of oil. Yet, to buy the energy that fueled its rise, China was forced to use the currency of its primary geopolitical rival. It was a deeply uncomfortable, strategically vulnerable position. Beijing had to accumulate massive amounts of US dollars, which it then used to buy US government bonds, effectively lending money to the very country it saw as its main competitor. The situation was a paradox, and for the leaders in Beijing, it was an unsustainable one. Then, in 2008, the system suffered a heart attack. The global financial crisis, which began with subprime mortgages in the United States, spiraled into a near-total collapse of the world's banking system. The very heart of the dollar empire, Wall Street, proved to be reckless, corrupt, and fundamentally unstable. The US government had to bail out its own banks to the tune of trillions of dollars. For the rest of the world, watching this unfold was a moment of profound disillusionment. The myth of American financial competence was shattered. Nations that had dutifully parked their national savings in US dollars and bonds suddenly wondered if their trust had been misplaced. Why, they asked, should the entire world be subject to the boom and bust cycles of the American economy? The quiet conversations began. In finance ministries and central banks from Moscow to Brasilia to New Delhi, officials started to explore ways to reduce their dependence on the dollar. The search for an alternative had begun. The seeds of rebellion, planted after the 2008 crisis, began to sprout in the form of a new alliance. BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. What started as a catchy acronym coined by a Goldman Sachs economist evolved into a formal political bloc. Their combined population represents over 40% of humanity. Their stated goal was to build a multipolar world order, one no longer dominated by a single power. A key part of that vision was to reform the global financial system, creating alternatives to the dollar-centric institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. They established their own development bank. They created a currency reserve pool. These were small steps, but the direction of travel was clear. They were building the scaffolding for a post-American world. But the true catalyst, the event that turned this slow-moving trend into a headlong rush for the exits, happened in February 2022. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States and its allies responded with sanctions of unprecedented scale and severity. They didn't just target Russian companies or individuals. They went for the jugular. They froze the foreign currency reserves of the Russian central bank. Over $300 billion held in Western banks vanished with the stroke of a pen. It was meant to be the financial nuclear option. A blow so devastating it would crash the Russian economy and force a swift end to the war. But it had a colossal, unintended consequence. It didn't just send a message to Moscow. It sent a shockwave across the entire globe. Leaders in Beijing, Riyadh, New Delhi, and beyond watched in horror. The revelation was terrifyingly simple. If the West could do this to a major power like Russia, they could do it to anyone. Their US dollar reserves, their holdings of US Treasury bonds, were not safe assets. They were potential hostages. At any moment, for any political disagreement, their nation's wealth could be confiscated. The weaponization of the dollar had backfired. Instead of demonstrating American power, it exposed the profound risk of being part of the American system. The fear of sanctions became the single greatest accelerant for de-dollarization. The dam of the petrodollar system began to break. The events came in a dizzying cascade. Saudi Arabia, the linchpin of the system for 50 years, began openly talking about accepting Chinese yuan for its oil sales to Beijing. This was once unthinkable, a direct violation of the foundational 1974 agreement. Then, in a stunning diplomatic maneuver, China brokered a peace deal between longtime rivals Saudi Arabia and Iran, a role historically played by the United States. America wasn't even in the room. Russia, locked out of the Western system, pivoted east. It began selling vast amounts of discounted oil to India and China, settling the trade not in dollars, but in rupees, yuan, and rubles. Brazil and China, two of the world's largest economies, announced a deal to conduct all of their bilateral trade, worth over $150 billion a year, in their own local currencies, completely bypassing the dollar. The BRICS alliance announced a major expansion, inviting key oil-producing nations like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Iran to join their ranks. The bloc was transforming from an economic club into a powerful coalition of energy producers and consumers, all united by a desire to break free from the dollar's grip. The change is no longer theoretical. It is happening now. The very foundation of the petrodollar, the exclusive pricing of global oil in U.S. currency, is being systematically dismantled. It is not one single event, but a death by 1,000 cuts. The world is actively and rapidly building a parallel financial universe where the dollar is no longer required. This shift in the tectonic plates of global finance is not some abstract geopolitical game. It has profound consequences for the lives of ordinary people, especially in the West. That exorbitant privilege the dollar provided for 50 years is now ending. For Americans, it was the secret ingredient to their prosperity. It meant the country could import cheap goods from around the world, keeping the cost of living artificially low. It meant the government could run massive deficits, funding its military and social programs by simply printing more money, which the rest of the world was forced to absorb. And it meant interest rates could be kept lower than they otherwise would be. As global demand for the dollar wanes, all of these advantages begin to reverse. The dollars that were once sent abroad to pay for oil and goods will start coming home. More dollars chasing the same amount of domestic goods leads to one thing: inflation. The persistent rise in the cost of food, gas, and housing is not just a temporary side effect of a pandemic or a distant war. It is a symptom of a much deeper structural change. It is the price of a declining empire. The world isn't moving to a new single reserve currency overnight. The Chinese yuan has its own problems, including capital controls that make it unattractive as a true global alternative. Instead, we are moving towards a multipolar currency world, a world of currency blocks. The dollar will remain important, but it will no longer be dominant. It will be one of several major currencies, alongside the euro, the yuan, and perhaps a future BRICS commodity-backed currency. In this new world, gold is making a dramatic comeback, not for citizens, but for central banks. Nations like China, Russia, and India are stockpiling physical gold at the fastest rate in recorded history. They are quietly rebuilding their reserves with a neutral asset, one that cannot be sanctioned or devalued by a foreign government. It is the ultimate insurance policy against a fiat currency system they no longer trust. But this is about more than just which currency is used for trade. It's a fundamental shift in global power. The institutions that governed the world for the last 75 years, the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, were all designed and dominated by the United States and its allies. China and the BRICS nations are now building their own parallel structures. The Belt and Road Initiative is a colossal infrastructure project, creating new trade routes centered on Eurasia. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank offers development loans without the political strings attached by its Western counterparts. A new empire is rising. It is not an empire of military conquest in the traditional sense. It is an empire of trade routes, infrastructure, technology standards, and financial networks. It is a vast, interconnected system being built from the east, designed to operate independently of the west. The quiet deal made in the Saudi desert created an American-centric world. The unraveling of that deal is creating a world we have never seen before. Empires are not eternal. History is a graveyard of great powers who believed their dominance was permanent. The Roman Empire, the Spanish Empire, the British Empire. Each had its time, and each saw its decline. Their currency, once the undisputed language of global commerce, faded into irrelevance. We are living through such a transition now. The end of the American financial empire. For half a century, the petrodollar system created a certain kind of order. It was a hierarchical order, with America at the top, but it was an order nonetheless. It provided a common framework for global trade and finance. The end of that order will not be simple or painless. The transition from one global system to another is always a period of instability and uncertainty. The world that replaces the American-led order may be more balanced and equitable. Or it may be more fragmented, chaotic, and dangerous, with rival blocs competing for resources and influence. The petrodollar was ultimately a confidence game. The world had confidence that the US would be a responsible steward of the global financial system. It had confidence that a dollar was a safe store of value, and that confidence was backed, implicitly, by the might of the US military. Today, that confidence is shattered. The stewardship is seen as self-serving. The currency is being devalued, and the military power is being challenged. The invisible architecture that shaped our world, that determined the price of everything and the power of everyone, is being dismantled brick by brick. We do not know what the new building will look like. We only know that we are living on a construction site. The ground beneath our feet is shifting, and the map of the 21st century is being redrawn before our very eyes.